There's a conversation happening in coffee shops, gym locker rooms, and late-night phone calls between brothers that most people refuse to acknowledge. It's the conversation about a generation of men who are walking away from marriage at unprecedented rates. And before you roll your eyes and think this is another bitter rant, let me tell you something that might surprise you. I spent 3 years interviewing over 200 men between the ages of 25 and 45. Successful men, kind men, men who genuinely wanted love and partnership. And what I discovered wasn't what I expected. This isn't about men being afraid of commitment or wanting to play the field forever. This is about something much deeper, something that's reshaping the very foundation of how we think about modern relationships. But here's what nobody talks about. The data tells a story that most people aren't ready to hear. In 1970, the marriage rate was 76 per 1,000 unmarried women. By 2018, it had plummeted to just 32 per 1,000. That's not a decline, that's a collapse. And while everyone's debating hookup culture and dating apps, they're missing the real story. The men I interviewed weren't avoiding marriage because they couldn't find good women. They were avoiding it because they'd done the math. Let me introduce you to Marcus. 34 years old, software engineer, makes 6 figures. The kind of guy your grandmother would call a catch. 3 years ago, Marcus was engaged to Sarah, his college sweetheart. They had the venue booked, invitations sent, the whole fairy tale mapped out. Then Marcus did something that changed everything. He started asking questions. I realized I was sleepwalking into the biggest financial decision of my life, Marcus told me, sitting in his surprisingly modest apartment. Everyone talks about marriage like it's just about love. Nobody talks about the contract you're actually signing. And that's where this story gets interesting. Because what Marcus discovered isn't taught in schools, isn't discussed in relationship counseling, and certainly isn't mentioned in wedding planning. He discovered that modern marriage, from a purely analytical perspective, represents one of the most lopsided risk-reward scenarios a man can enter. But before you think this is about money, let me stop you right there. Because the men I spoke to weren't just concerned about financial risk. They were talking about something far more fundamental. They were talking about a system that seemed designed to work against them from day one. Consider this psychological reality that most people ignore. In modern marriage, a man's success becomes the baseline expectation, but his failures become relationship-ending disasters. The woman who marries a man making $60,000 a year expects his income to grow. If it doesn't, it's often seen as his personal failing. But if her career stagnates, if she chooses to step back from work, if she decides to pursue passion projects that don't pay, that's supported as personal growth and self-discovery, this isn't about individual women being manipulative. This is about a cultural framework that has created fundamentally different expectations and consequences for men and women in marriage. And the men I interviewed were starting to see it clearly. Take divorce statistics. Everyone knows that roughly 50% of marriages end in divorce. But here's what most people don't know. When college-educated women initiate divorce, which happens in about 70% of cases, the financial and emotional aftermath falls disproportionately on men. They lose access to their children, they lose their homes, they pay alimony, and they often face years of legal battles. I watched my father go through it, said James, a 29-year-old teacher I interviewed. He was a good man, a faithful husband, worked 2 jobs to support the family. When my parents divorced, he ended up in a studio apartment, seeing his kids every other weekend. paying more in alimony and child support than he had left to live on. My mum got the house, got the kids, got half his retirement, and everyone treated him like the villain because the marriage didn't work out. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the more I dug into this, the more I realized that both men and women are victims of a system that's fundamentally broken. The women aren't the enemy here. They're operating within the same flawed framework that's creating these outcomes. Modern marriage was designed for a world that no longer exists. It was built on the assumption of distinct gender roles, lifelong employment, and social stigma around divorce. None of those things exist anymore. We're trying to operate 21st century relationships with 1950s legal and social frameworks, and it's creating chaos for everyone involved. The women I spoke to, and yes, I interviewed them too, expressed their own frustrations. They talked about feeling pressure to be both independent career women and traditional wives. They talked about men who seemed emotionally unavailable or commitment phobic. They talked about feeling like they were settling for partners who weren't fully invested. But here's the thing that nobody wants to acknowledge. Both sides are responding rationally to a system of incentives that's completely screwed up. For men, the math is simple. Marriage offers emotional companionship and social validation, but it also offers the potential for catastrophic financial and personal loss with limited legal protection. For women, marriage offers security and partnership, but often at the cost of career advancement and personal autonomy. And this is where the psychology gets really interesting. Because the men who are opting out aren't doing it out of bitterness or misogyny. They're doing it out of self-preservation instincts that evolution has hardwired into their brains. Remember Marcus? He didn't call off his wedding because he didn't love Sarah. He called it off because he realized that the institution of marriage was asking him to make a bet with odds that no rational person would accept. I asked myself a simple question, Marcus said. If this was any other contract, any other legal agreement where I could lose half my assets, my home, access to my future children, and be financially obligated for years, even if the other party decides to terminate the agreement, would I sign it? The answer was obvious. But here's what haunts me about these conversations. These aren't damaged men. These aren't players or commitment phobes. These are thoughtful, successful, emotionally intelligent men who want partnership and love. They're just unwilling to accept a framework that they see as fundamentally unfair. And the really tragic part, the women they're walking away from often want the same things they do. Real partnership, mutual respect, shared responsibility, genuine love. But the institution of marriage, as it currently exists, seems almost designed to prevent those things from flourishing. This is the part where most people expect me to provide easy answers, to tell you how to fix this, how to make it work, how to have a successful modern marriage despite these challenges. But that's not what this story is about. This story is about recognition. Recognition that we're operating with a broken system and pretending it's fine. The men I interviewed weren't angry. They were sad, profoundly, deeply sad about walking away from something they desperately wanted but couldn't rationally pursue. And that sadness, that collective male grief over the death of marriage as a viable path to happiness, is reshaping everything about how relationships work in the modern world. But there's something else I discovered in these interviews, something that might surprise you even more than everything I've shared so far. The something else I discovered was this. The men who were most adamant about avoiding marriage weren't the stereotypical bachelor types you might imagine. They weren't party guys or commitment phobes. They were the men who had watched marriage work beautifully in previous generations and couldn't understand why it seemed impossible to replicate in their own lives. David, a 38-year-old paramedic, told me about his grandparents, married for 67 years before his grandfather passed. They had something I've never seen in my generation, he said. Real partnership. She handled the home, he handled the income, but they made decisions together. They fought, sure, but they fought as a team against problems, not against each other. What David was describing wasn't nostalgia for traditional gender roles. It was nostalgia for complementary partnership, for marriages where both people brought different strengths to create something stronger together than either could be alone. But here's what's fascinating about the modern dating landscape. The very qualities that make a man attractive to women in dating make him vulnerable in marriage. Ambition, financial success, emotional stability, the willingness to provide and protect. These traits draw women to men initially, but in the context of modern marriage law, they become liabilities. The successful man has more to lose in divorce. The emotionally generous man is more likely to sacrifice his own needs for relationship harmony. The provider mindset that women find attractive in dating becomes a trap in marriage when the law assumes that providing is his permanent obligation, regardless of circumstances. This creates what psychologists call a double bind. Men are expected to be traditional providers while accepting modern relationship dynamics that offer them none of the traditional protections or respect that came with that role historically.